For some reason, when I share my screen, I can't see anyone.
I don't know how to.
So
correct.
if you put it in, if you go ahead and share your screen, and then if you go ahead and put it in presentation mode. So pull up. Now, can you see everyone else?
Oh, I figured it out. Okay.
Great.
Great. Okay, we can see your slides, so off you go.
Okay. My name is Enuyoung, and this is my very last course of the semester. I'm very excited that I'll be graduating in December. This project is something that I always wanted to do, but I wasn't sure when I'd be able to do it because my family history is unique, and I'd like to share some of that this afternoon. I wasn't able to do that before really this opportunity. It doesn't directly relate to my major. You know, how to make a movie does help from my major, but this is the topic I chose, origins, meeting from my grandparents to the generation of my parents and to the generation on my horizontal level, my siblings and myself. Briefly, let me talk about Korean history. It's only, there are only about 180,000 to 300,000 deaf people who are in Korea. So it means deaf people comprise a very small percentage of the population. And Korean Sign Language was introduced in the 20th century. Now, Japan colonized the Korean Peninsula, and so JSL, Japanese Sign Language, influenced the later Korean Sign Language that was established because of that colonization history. And just very recently, in 2015, was Korean Sign Language recognized as one of Korea's official languages. So that was a very recent happening. And there are 25 schools for the deaf in Korea. In case you don't know, in the United States, there are about 300 schools for the deaf in the United States, and in Korea, comparatively, only 25. So again, a very small number. So let me talk about me. My grandparents, my parents, and myself are all deaf. I'm considered a third generation deaf individual. I am from South Korea. We moved to America when I was 14 years old, and we moved here because there were better educational opportunities for me. In Korea, I would go to public schools there. There were no access services like interpreters or support for deaf students there. So I tried my best to read lips and understand my classmates. I'd ask my friends what the teacher was saying, but there really was no access support provided to me. I did go to the school for the deaf when I was in 7th grade. And the deaf school teachers did not know how to sign in Korean Sign Language. So we were teaching the teachers how to use our language. And it was honestly a waste of my educational years to be teaching the adults Korean Sign Language. It's ironic. They were supposed to be teaching us the content. We ended up teaching them the language. So I talked with my family. I felt like I was wasting my time. I didn't want to waste any more time in school, in the deaf schools or the public schools. And I was fortunate to have an aunt who lived here in America. And I will explain more about how my aunt moved here and her story. But anyway, my aunt is deaf as well. she went to a university, she graduated, and she became a teacher. And I could not even imagine that life for myself. I wanted to know how she did that. And I realized that she did that because she moved to America. And so we had a family discussion and we made the decision to come to America. I was in 8th grade at that time. When we arrived, I experienced culture shock. The teachers in my school signed ASL fluently. I didn't know ASL. I did go to a mainstream school for a short time. They provided an interpreter and a note taker and some tutoring, but the culture here in America was so completely different than Korea. It wasn't successful to me. So I thought about what my grandparents and what my parents went through living in Korea. My grandmother and grandfather never graduated from school. Well, my grandmother did graduate from one of the schools, but my grandfather never did. My father dropped out in 6th grade from school. And so thinking about being the 3rd generation in the deaf family, a deaf family who has experienced depression, I wanted to carve out a different path and a new path for my generation, the 3rd generation of deaf people. So as the slide shares, and I've already mentioned the educational challenges in Korea, that it wasn't accessible, even though some deaf people are really very smart. They often don't get good jobs. They end up working in factories, warehouses, or manual labor because of their barriers to education. So they're told they can't a lot and they believe it, and so they can't get professional jobs. Now here in the United States, there are laws that protect the rights of deaf people. And in Korea, there are only interpreters in 2 specific areas. Imagine if there were only 2 interpreters in the city of Rochester. They would be booking appointments for the people that they could service, but they wouldn't be servicing many people. And often in Korea, the sentiment is pity when thinking about a family having deaf people in the family. So there was messages of sympathy and pity that were always shared with our family, and we found that quite frustrating. Briefly, here are some family pictures. I have a multi-generational deaf family. And the picture on the left is the grandchildren. They're all hearing except me and my sister. We're deaf. The middle picture is my grandparents and their children, which includes my parents. They're completely deaf, everyone in that picture. And they all use Korean Sign Language to communicate with one another. I'm very fluent in that language. And only 2 people who were there where they were adopted by white people in America. Okay. I can see. Okay, I'm going to change my slide. Okay. Okay, so this QR code, I made a movie about my family. It's a 20-minute YouTube video, and you can go ahead and scan the QR code. I know there's not enough time to show this video during this class, but I thought maybe we could watch it for a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes or so. And then the rest of the 15 minutes left in the video, then you would watch it on your own. So has everybody been able to scan the QR code? Does it work okay? I'm seeing head nods, so I will continue. Okay, the entire video is in Korean Sign Language, so it's completely in the sign language. And I have gotten feedback from a hearing person who said there's a lot of environmental noise in the background. So please turn off your sound, because if you don't, it will be hard on your ears, because I didn't realize about the environmental sounds. But then also make sure you turn on the captioning, the subtitles. So you can go ahead and watch 5 minutes of that and see how it goes. My goal is that I want to upload this on Facebook or Instagram. I want to share my family story with others. And I'd like to add also in the story of my aunt. She was adopted by a family in America. We didn't see her for 10 or 15 years. And then the family got together again, and after we moved to America. So as you watch the YouTube, you'll probably understand the whole story. But I do want to share one story within my presentation about my grandmother. My grandmother's dad, meaning my great-grandfather, was hearing. And so he had a deaf daughter, and that was back in the 1950s, I believe. And my great-grandfather worked, he was the mayor in a specific town in South Korea. And they had a board meeting at my great-grandfather's home. He was so embarrassed to have a child who was deaf. And also he had a second child who was deaf, and he was so embarrassed, he actually physically hid them in the closet while the board meeting was continuing in his home. And then after the board meeting was complete and everybody left, he let them out of the closet. So that is really an unforgettable story that is a truth from my family lineage that my grandfather lived through, or my grandmother lived through, excuse me. My grandfather never learned how to read or write. He didn't learn sign language until he was almost 30. My father didn't know sign language until later in life either. And that just shows the barriers that they had to education. Because we moved to America, I've been very fortunate. And so the barriers I experienced in Korea, I didn't experience here in America. But I'm going to wrap my presentation up now and encourage you to watch the rest of the YouTube video I made on your own time. And if you have any feedback on that movie, it's very easy to edit it, and I would love your feedback before I release it on Facebook, Instagram, or other social media platforms.
So, Enuyoung, I'm going to start with this question. You said that your family, your parents and yourself, that you got frustrated in school with the fact that you weren't learning very much, and that you were in fact the teacher rather than the student as far as sign language is concerned. And you were 14 years old, and there was a discussion with your parents about moving to America. So it's a little difficult to picture a 14-year-old persuading her parents to move across the world and move into a totally different country and a totally different culture and totally different language. So I wonder if you could describe that particular conversation a little bit. How did that go? How long did it take? What the arguments were? What the points were that were raised? And I guess how close you were to not coming.
The interpreters are just switching, so let's give.
All right, yes, I'm happy to answer all of those questions. My aunt, who moved here to America and was adopted, she found our family and then visited us in South Korea. And I think I was about 2 or 3. It was at that time that they had a deaf niece. So they were able to teach me, ABCs in sign language, and I was extremely motivated to learn. They showed me the love for American food. We went to McDonald's at the time because that's what we thought was extremely American. And it was my aunt who started to really encourage my mom to make the move to America because the deaf education here in America is way better than in South Korea. They thought I was too young to move to America at that time. At that time, I was around 4 or 5, so they told me I wasn't able to move at that age. And there's one clip in the video where I'm talking about my feelings on America. So you'll see it once you get through the video a little bit. And I'm telling people and I'm telling my friends how I want to go to America, but unfortunately, it wasn't a possibility financially. Again, I was always frustrated with the school system in South Korea, and I told my mom that I pretty much slept at school. I didn't have access, and then I would be up all night at home playing games, sleep again at school because I wouldn't learn anything. I didn't have access, and my mom in that moment realized how severe the lack of access was. And I think about that time, I was age 14, and that's when I started to become cognizant of different cultures and different languages. So at that time, it was a tough choice to have that discussion with my family of wanting to make the move to America, because I know my parents didn't want to. I know they didn't want to make the move. I know they didn't want to move to America. They didn't want to establish or learn a new culture. So they decided to stay in South Korea, and I decided to move to America, which we all then agreed on. And we said that if in 1 year I didn't like it, that I'd move back home. And it was on those terms that I agreed. So we all flew to America together. They dropped me off and then they went back home. And I thought that was the worst decision I could make at that time because I figured I was too young. I moved to live with my aunt, and I thought I was going to want to just move back after the year. After the year, my parents asked me how I felt about it and if I wanted to move back home. And I said no. I realized that every day as time went on, I learned so much more. I learned more in 1 year here than in my 14 years in Korea. And I didn't want to lose that opportunity to have another year here. So I decided to stay until I graduated high school in the States. And after I graduated from high school, I decided to stay until college. So I kept extending my deadline, you could say. And I'm still here. So you could say I kind of never wanted to go back. I do love living in the States and what the States have afforded me as far as opportunities for a deaf person.
So your parents went back to Korea and they stayed in Korea.
That's right.
Wow.
Yeah, that's right. And thank you to today's technology where we are fortunate to FaceTime and stay updated, where before we had to write letters, but luckily now we can have a face-to-face interaction that we didn't have before.
So let me switch gears a little bit. So you're going to graduate very soon with a baccalaureate degree. And what are you going to do next?
I'm staying here in Arizona. I'm going to look for work full-time. I just visited Korea about 2 years ago. Or was it 2 years? It was definitely before COVID hit. So around 2019, I did visit back home, and to be honest, I can't imagine myself back in Korea. I'd still struggle with access. I'd still struggle finding interpreters. I'd still struggle with the oppressive experiences a deaf person will experience in Korea. I know my family's still there, and my sister is deaf and who is an activist. I respect my family, so I could imagine myself going back home to advocate with my sister and see my family, but I can't see a life there anymore.
So your sister didn't ever come to the United States?
She did visit. Funny enough, I have 2 reasons why they wouldn't want to live here. First, which I think makes sense, is that our parents are getting older, so we need to make sure there's someone there to take care of them. And to be honest, the better decision is my sister than me. The second is that guns are allowed here in the United States, and my sister does have a safety concern with that living in America and the easy access to guns, which we don't have that concern in Korea. So that's another reason that's keeping my sister abroad.
Please tell your sister that I agree with her. So thank you very much, Enuyoung. That was a fabulous story and a great presentation. I'm really glad that you got this opportunity to tell your family story. It is a wonderful story. So thank you. Meg?
Thank you. Thank you all for watching. Thank you.
So I really enjoyed that, Enuyoung. And I think that there's so much value to looking back at your personal history and your family history, and putting context to their history and therefore your own. My question is, what skills would you say were your takeaways from, I mean, I can think of so many things that you exercised through doing this project, but what would you say is the biggest skill / lesson that you came away with having finished this project and this film?
I could say that my hardest or my biggest overcoming throughout this project was to ask for help. One question in the list made sense as far as content, but that was kind of hard for me on how I can make everything accessible. So as you saw, Korean Sign Language to spoken English. I had to think about the translation and the access throughout this presentation. So I think that was a struggle for me throughout this presentation, the ability to adapt between languages, because that means I had to work through 4 languages within my own head, right? Korean, Korean Sign Language, to ASL, to then spoken English or written English. So that, I think, was my biggest challenge, because then I had to go back as well as freshen up my own written Korean and Korean Sign Language, as well as I've never worked on such a long project before. So I had to familiarize myself and ask questions, seek resources on how to add captioning for a very long video, yet make them clear, cohesive, and include that cultural mediation across translations. Well, luckily, once I got it down, I proceeded with ease. Now I have gained that skill on adding translations or closed captioning to videos. I also had to remind myself that not the audience would know or be familiar with Korean culture. So I had to make sure that I had and establish enough information where the audience can have some foundation and can establish some connection to my presentation and to my topic. I can't expect the audience to already come in prepped in with Korean culture and traditions. So I had to reach out to family and friends to give me some feedback on my presentations, what makes sense, what does not make sense, what can I add, what can I clarify within this project.
So that's a great answer. And I think, you know, exercising those professional muscles of asking for help and adaptability and flexibility are fantastic. So I think those, along with all the other things that you had to practice, interviewing and the filming and the personal research, really made it a dynamic project. So nice job.
Thank you.
So let's now leave Enuyoung and move to Samantha.
All right, let me get my share up. All right. Can everyone see that okay? I know it's loading
Uh,
right now.
Not yet. There. Okay.
Awesome. Okay, perfect. So my name is Sam Tako. I'm in the School of Individualized Study. I'm doing a concentration in museum studies and visual culture. And the title of my capstone is Innovative Interactions, Visitor Engagement, and Accessibility in Museums. And my little one sentence summary is a look into the way we interact within museums and furthermore, how they are able to help us. So for my project, I really wanted to create something in which I could not only showcase my knowledge of exhibition design techniques, but also show what I've learned about accessibility and an interaction within the world of museums, because I think it's really important. I think elements like accessibility and interaction are often overlooked in the way that they work in museums. And I think that it's something that needs to have more attention drawn to it. So I thought that a theoretical exhibition on these topics would be a very fun and interesting way to educate people on the topic. First, I wanted to start off by asking everyone to reflect back on their own experiences with museums and like other institutions that are similar. I want you to think about what has possibly stood out to you in museums, what you prefer, if it's reading labels or if you prefer to interact with the history instead. And really, the most important one is what helps you remember your experiences. Now, I wanted to ask these specific questions because it's crucial in understanding how we typically behave in museum institutions, because certain tools and techniques tend to work better for some people than others. So it's important to think about the various perspectives that we have to consider. Just like how some people have different preferences with how they learn or how they teach, people also have varying preferences on how they absorb information in a museum institution. While one person may prefer small video presentations, others may be drawn to reading information off a page or interacting directly with the history. What is this project about? I kind of narrowed it down into 4 points that tell what the main focus is, and that would be number one, taking a closer look at what draws our attention within museums. Also emphasizing the importance of interactive technologies within museum institutions, learning about the methods that we use constantly to grab the attention of visitors, and also exploring how these technologies and improvements aid us in terms of accessibility. Once again, this exhibition is very heavily focused on interaction, accessibility, and even the way that museums have been evolving over time. As we know, a lot of the technologies that we commonly see today in museums have not been around since the beginning of museums as they know it, but they certainly opened a new world of accessibility and possibility for opportunities in terms of how we interact with the art, history, science, whatever the topic of the museum is that we find ourselves immersed in. And of course, museums don't need these technologies to be successful or effective, but as times change and we find ourselves in a more digitalized world, these technologies certainly allow us to experience museums in a newer and more accessible and interesting way. For some of the materials that I will be handing in for this capstone, I wanted to look at these 3 specifically because they're the main focus. The interpretive plan essentially is a plan of the beginning steps of the process for making an exhibition before you specifically select artifacts and items that you're going to include. And it usually includes things like the main goals for the exhibition, what the audience may be, what are the main interpretive themes that are involved, and a lot of the strategies that are used to achieve the set goals that you come up with. The second one would be the dossier, which is usually takes the form of an itemized list along with some pictures, and it shows the gist of the artifacts, pictures, videos, and any of the other items that will be included within the exhibition, as well as telling what form they may take, if they're a picture, if they're a video, if they're interactive, all those such things. And the third one is the label copy suite, and that is typically a collection of labels that can be used in a number of different contexts, but specifically for my project, I will be using the label copy suite to focus on the labels that outline each section of my exhibition and kind of give an introduction to as what the visitor should expect when going through each section. For the location and layout of my exhibition, I wanted to choose something on RIT campus, so I chose actually the RIT Press It's a scholarly book publishing enterprise that's located on the second floor of the RIT library. It's right outside of the Carey collection. And why did I choose this area? I chose this because it's on campus, which means it'll be available to students like myself who are in the museum studies program or anyone who's interested. And it also has an atypical layout. For the location and layout of my exhibition, I wanted to do something a little different compared to the normal typical rectangular room that you oftentimes see in a museum. And for an exhibition split into multiple sections like the one that I was working on, I thought a round space would be really intriguing, especially being able to display items on the inside and outside of the space. And you can see in my little diagram that I made in the bottom left that for the first 4 sections, those being QR codes, audio tours, maps, and apps, I put them all along the outside of the space. I was planning on doing some sort of paper going around so you can't see inside until you go into the area. So the first 4 sections would be lining the outside of the space, as they're mostly items that can be hung up on the wall and things like that. But for the 5th section, which is hands-on activities, I wanted to put it inside the RIT Press location because it's activities that require more space, like VR experiences and things that you can interact with. So I put that inside to allow for enough space for the activities. And now I wanted to go into the specific sections for my proposed exhibition, and I included some of the pictures of some of the artifacts that will be hung up on the different sections and shown. For the first section, which is QR codes, I wanted to focus on how they've been around in museums for a very long time. However, they've been often overlooked due to confusion on how they work. Fortunately, it has been made a lot easier with the evolution of smartphones. You can now just scan QR codes with your normal camera. You don't have to download any apps to be able to scan these codes. And they can be used for a enormous variety of reasons, such as getting more information on specific pieces that you may be seeing some artifacts up close that you might not be able to physically get close to, or accessing complementary sources, whether it's videos, websites, or just additional information on your phone. The top picture shows a QR code used within the Explore Historic Manville exhibition in Manville, Louisiana. It's a good example of how QR codes can be used to avoid cluttered and wordy signs that may divert attention away from important information, and instead opting for a more digitalized, organized information that you can have on your phone screen. And the bottom picture shows a QR code that is included inside a pamphlet at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York City. And this one can be used to open a mobile guide that can help you navigate around the museum, as well as bringing up a lot of accessible other helpful features. For the second section, I wanted to focus on audio tours. It's talking about how we are tending to move away from the standard audio tours that we used to see that would have a guide at the beginning and have a group following. So we're moving away from the idea that you have to keep up with the pace of the group that you're in. You now have the ability to choose an experience catered to your needs, whether that's the length or the path that the tour takes. And they even have made some great strides on making theme tours that combine entertainment with traditional guide experiences. So it's really good for children because you're walking around a museum and they're just looking at everything but not really taking anything in. But when you give it a story, it grabs the viewer's attention. The top image is from the British Museum. In 2014, they actually redesigned their entire audio tour system, and now it includes 10 languages, a variety of tours that vary in length, subject matter, popularity of artifacts, and much more, such as like accessibility and being able to travel to different areas in the museum. They're trying to reach a broader audience. And the lower image is from the Getty Villa in Malibu, California. And this one is really interesting because it combines their perfect collection of Greek, Etruscan, and Roman artifacts with an audio tour that's a narrative themed around the popular book series Percy Jackson and the Olympians, because it has the same theme. It has a quest element where people can answer questions based on the artifacts that they're seeing, and it will give you a different ending depending on the answers that you give to their questions. My third section is improved maps. We're focusing on moving from paper maps to more digitalized maps that help with accessibility reasons. It helps with getting specific directions to areas you might want to visit or artifacts you might want to see. as I said, it's more accessible and can be used on phones or screens that are located on site, as well as still being paper copies. And it really helps with the planning of personalized experiences based on interest or limitations. And my example was the first picture located on the top. It's from the Museum of London. It's a sensory map, and it's actually intended for people who have autism spectrum conditions. And it includes factors like bright and dark spaces, busy spaces, quiet and noisy spaces to better cater your experience based on what you need for your limitations. And the bottom picture shows a map from the American Museum of Natural History. And on their app, it's essentially like the GPS you would use in your car. It gives you step-by-step instructions on how to get to specific exhibitions, to specific artifacts, and it'll tell you step-by-step, turn left here, make a right over here. And it really, I've used it before in the museum, and it's extremely helpful to get around. Section 4 would be focusing on applications. And this is obviously one that has been more developed in recent times as we've been digitally better at creating new apps to help people. It allows access to tools otherwise usually only available by purchase on site, like audio tours with an MP3 device or digital maps that you would commonly have to just get a physical copy of. And a lot of these applications can actually be used either on site or at home, depending on what they are. You can have visual tours from any location, like your living room, or you can look up artifacts from different collections from the safety of your home. It also provides new and exciting ways to interact with artifacts or artworks that you can see off-site. The top picture shows the app called Smartify. It's actually an app that can be used inside an institution or outside of an institution. It works with a vast number of museums, observatories, and other institutions, and it allows visitors to scan artworks with their camera to learn more information, to learn a plethora of different perspectives from other people, not just the institution that you're located at, and even listen to some audio on the piece itself. While the bottom picture focuses on the Ask Brooklyn Museum app. And this is an app that specifically you use when you're at the Brooklyn Museum, and it allows visitors to ask questions, gain information, and share insights via live one-on-one chats. And they have a whole board of different knowledgeable experts like anthropologists, archaeologists, art historians, and educators, constantly ready to answer any questions that you may have while you're walking around. And the last section that I will be focusing on for my exhibition is hands-on activities. This is a very fun section because it allows you to do a lot of things that have not been allowed in museums before. It allows you to interact with things you ordinarily wouldn't be able to with VR opportunities. You can more easily explore collections with touchscreen activities. And the most fun part, you can even participate in workshops where you're able to sometimes create something to take home to remember your experience by. The top picture on the right, it shows an experience from the Louvre in Paris, and it's called Mona Lisa Beyond the Glass. And in this experience, visitors are able to get a much closer, more detailed look at specifically the Mona Lisa painting. And you can explore how it's changed over the course of 500 years due to exposure to light and humidity. And you can even learn about the subject, the actual Mona Lisa in the Mona Lisa painting, due to the narrative component of the experience. And the bottom pic shows the art lens wall at the Cleveland Museum of Art. This 40-foot display allows for numerous visitors to use it at once. And you can look through all the works from their permanent collections. And they categorize it into different subjects based on if it's highlighted works, if there's a certain theme for all the works together, or some of them are even light sensitive works that aren't able to be hung up in the museum, but they still have the access to it through this collection, which I thought was very interesting. And that is all my sections. Any questions?
You want to go first, Meg?
Yes, I'd love to. So Sam, that was really comprehensive, and I really enjoyed it. I loved all the photographs that you included. It made your topic very accessible to your audience. So my question is, when you talk about the exhibition, are you talking about a theoretical exhibition? Or so a theoretical exhibition. All right.
Yes.
So that part of your final project or your final deliverable?
It's a little bit confusing because with planned theoretical exhibitions, there's only so much you can do before it becomes a real exhibition. So I'm planning on turning in things like the layout, which would include like the different sections and how it would be laid out. It would include the list of artifacts that I'm planning to include. It would show the plan that I made and what goals I want to achieve. But there wouldn't be like necessarily like a 3D model where everything is like laid out together.
Okay. And remind me again, I know that you said it at the beginning, but so museum studies and
Visual culture.
visual culture. Okay. So will this become part of a portfolio piece or part of a deliverable that you can use when you're looking for opportunities at a museum or an aquarium?
Most likely. I really wanted to show what I've learned in terms of how you go through the process of developing an exhibition, not necessarily making it into a real exhibition where you're actually setting up a physical location, but I've done a lot of work with the planning process of the before. So I really wanted to focus on that. And really my passion when looking at museums is how we are moving into a new digital age and how accessibility has become more important and how we can incorporate it better into museums that may not be as accessible.
Well, I think that your presentation and Young's presentation are well paired together, and I think that I think you hit on just leveling up the museum experience mainstream, but also obviously really hitting on the accessibility piece for people that come in with some different abilities. So it's really comprehensive. It's a really nice job.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
So
Stephen.
Sam, I have a couple of questions too. So this is a fascinating idea. The idea for the project, it was fascinating to begin with, and your implementation has not reduced the level of fascination with the idea. Is this designing a sort of a theoretical, is this something that museum studies students do? I mean, or did you come up with this by yourself and you know, people don't usually make theoretical exhibitions?
In a lot of my classes, we have worked on the pieces of designing an exhibition, not necessarily like doing what I did and putting all the pieces together. It was either work on a specific section, like make a floor plan or make an interpretive plan. But usually these things are done with a group. It's usually a group effort. So doing it on my own was a new experience for me, even though I was familiar with all the strategies that I had to use. So it was actually really interesting to get to be the only person in control of the decision. So it was definitely a new experience based off of things that I had previously done before.
So very, very comprehensive treatment of your topic. Have you shared this with museum studies professors, any of your professors?
I was planning on sharing it with them. I wanted to get it to a place where I was proud of the work and the completion level of it. So I was waiting until I finished up like the last few pieces to share it, because actually this whole project was inspired by a professor I've had. I don't know if any of you know of her, Julie Decker. I love her to pieces, and she really showed me how important interaction and accessibility is in museums. So I should definitely send this to her once I'm perfectly happy with how it looks and everything.
Well, I'd say it looks pretty professional to me.
Thank you.
So I do, you know, I'm sort of old, or not really, sort of really old. And I like the way I used to go around museums. I mean, and now, yeah, I have a phone. I don't know whether I don't know what the, you know, what the demographics of phone use are, but I assume that not everybody has a phone.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would be somewhat worried that you've moved everything, or not you, but the field has moved in the direction of digital for obvious reasons, and nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's probably does make it more accessible to a lot of people, but it doesn't make it accessible to somebody who isn't into the digital age yet. And I assume there's a fairly large proportion of the population that applies to. So I would be a little bit concerned. I mean, I guess we're still at the transition point, you know, right? So, but I would be a little bit concerned that making everything digital, it makes it inaccessible to people who aren't ready for that. For example, I like the idea of maybe it's just because I'm used to it. I like the idea of having a guide who you know, explains things and responds to the audience in the real time. I was in London a couple of years ago and went on a tour of a particular part of the city, and the guide was humorous and local and knew a whole lot of stuff that wouldn't necessarily have shown up in a digital rendition of the tour. So I don't know whether that's a major point, but I would worry about that a little bit if I was you, right? I mean, you want to be accessible to as close to 100% of the audience as possible.
Absolutely. And this is actually something we've discussed a lot in my museum classes, because we talk about the pros and the cons of bringing these digital elements in, being that, oh, if there's QR codes, what if people don't have phones? And I believe we talked about, there was one museum, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I believe that they were handing out like older models of mobile phones for people who didn't have them, so they could scan and use those technologies. But it's all about, you don't want to completely go to digital. You want to have a good balance between the digital for the people who need different things for their accessibility, and keeping like the guided tours and stuff like that for the people who do prefer that. It's a good, you want to have a good mix of both. Yeah,
good. I'm glad you said that, because I really, you know, that with the guide that on that tour of London, it was exceptional. It was a great experience going around with. And I don't think I could have got that in any other way. So I'm glad you're still thinking about that balance of the old and the new. So that's good to know. I guess. Oh, another question. So I think this is, you know, this is an important question. Going to a museum, you have to decide, okay, we're going to go to a museum and we're going to put our coats on and we're going to drive, and where are we going to park, and what are we going to pay to get inside, and what are we going to do with our bags, and all that stuff that goes with going to a museum. And then you got, well, I can go to the museum in my living room. So what's that about? I mean, there's, you know, you actually experience in real time, as opposed to, it's sort of a virtual experience if you do it from your living room, but you still see the artifacts, right? So that's another balance thing, I guess. I guess, you know, there's pros and cons for doing it both ways, but I like the idea. Okay, we're going to go to a museum and we're going to see the stuff in real time right there in front of us. I mean, you go and see the Mona Lisa, it's very hard. I don't know if you've ever been, but it's very hard to get close enough to actually appreciate the detail. But still, that's part of the experience, you know, and that's good. That's good stuff. So I don't know. I mean, they have different pros and cons, I guess, in both ways.
We've also talked a lot about, especially with the start of COVID, when everything switched to digital, we did a lot of work on virtual exhibitions and tours that you can do on your computer that you don't actually have to go into the museum for. And while that's good for accessibility, and if you can't physically go somewhere, it's not the same experience as going in person and hearing people talk about the artworks and seeing it for yourself. It's sometimes harder to read labels in a virtual exhibition because they don't have everything labeled for digital like content. So once again, it's a mix between, it's definitely a different experience when you do it completely virtual, but it still gives you a similar sort of feeling as if you were to go there in person. Right.
It's certainly better than not going at all, I guess.
Yes.
I would still like to actually go. I mean, you go to the British Museum, it's just sitting in the cafeteria is an experience, right? So
Absolutely.
going to the gift shop and all that, everything that goes with it. All right. Well, I really enjoyed your presentation. Fabulous job. I really think your idea was great to begin with, as I said, and you really knocked it out of the park. So good job, Sam.
Thank you so much.
Meg, do you want to do the wrap up?
Yes, absolutely. So just a thank you again to our interpreters for being here, and for the two of you, such really great presentations. And Michelle, who is definitely the MVP of our capstone presentations thus far. Thank
Aw.
you. So just as a reminder, the Capstone Symposium is December 2nd, and you need to have your sized submitted to the Dropbox by tomorrow. And then just a additional reminder, although I'm sure you haven't forgotten, that you have two papers, a reflection and a product paper to turn in. And those can be placed in the same folder in the assignments Dropbox in my courses. So hope you have a great Thanksgiving break, restful and safe and healthy. And if you're traveling, travel safely. But great job. And we look forward to seeing you next week.
Yes,
Thank
indeed.
you so
And,
much.
since we've spoken so much about accessibility today, we should really make sure that we thank Gail and Emilio for your interpretation. Thanks, guys. See you all.
Have a good holiday, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody.
Wow, that was so much better than this morning.
It was. And